So Stephanie, you visited a ton of countries, including Iraq and Sudan. So some of the biggest stories you've covered include being on ground zero for 9/11, living in the Middle East as a producer for 3 years and covering 7 Olympic Games. And now it's been a few weeks since you've been back from Liberia covering the Ebola story with Adrienne Arsenault. So tell me, what went through your mind when CBC told you that they want you to cover this?
It was certainly gave me pause for thought. I've been to a lot of crazy places in the world. I've done wars, disasters, with some of the best correspondents like Adrienne. But this particular assignment, really for a lot of news organizations around the world, was totally unprecedented. To go into a health crisis like this that is a little bit of the unknown factor because of the scariness of Ebola. Until we really educated ourselves, it does take you aback. But we really did not know what we were going to get into. We had to really educate ourselves. How do we prepare properly? What's the best kind of gear to bring? The team itself. How many people are part of this team? We felt in the end it was important to keep it as small as possible. The smaller it is, the better you can control your environment. I've been with very large teams in very risky situations, and sometimes it's like herding cats. And you know, the more people you have, the more to control the riskier, the more dangerous potential. Right.
There was so much unknown, but you mentioned to me earlier in an email that the intention of the series was to focus on Ebola in West Africa and less on the hysteria. Yeah. So why is that, and what did you ensure to do this?
I mean, there was, as Ebola sort of entered the news consciousness of newsrooms and of the public in general, I think it's a scary thing, but if you educate yourself, you realize it is very difficult to actually catch it. And the thing with the West Africa story and the Ebola story is there were very few international news crews there, especially TV. So to really tell the story properly, part of CBC's mandate is we do these things. We invest in these things. They're important. Telling the story on the ground there, it hits home. We want to make sure that we go to keep the focus where the need is the most. You have thousands of people sick and dying. Here there's a scare about, one person getting into a hospital. There's not going to be an outbreak in North America. We have indoor plumbing. We have good sanitary conditions. We have a healthcare system. You cannot compare the situations, and so you have to keep the focus there and where the problem really is.
And you mentioned bringing it home, but for some Canadians watching back home, it may be a little hard to be attached to it when it's happening so far away. So how do you make the story reach out to them specifically? I did notice in one of the videos you took the audience on the plane with you there.
Yeah. It was wishful optimism that boarded a flight a few weeks ago. Misperceptions too. This one of the only airlines still flying into Liberia, into the heart of the worst Ebola outbreak in history. Our mistake to believe a problem so acute would have a compassionate cavalry riding in to save the day. Yet, look at all the empty seats. Hardly.
That was actually a sort of mini documentary we produced when we returned about the entire journey. But while we were there, we did focus on specific news stories, and like I just mentioned, it is bringing the story of a mother, a father, for example. A parent here in Canada can relate to a child being sick. These are people just as human as you and I. They go through the same things. They have to put food on the table. They have to take care of their children, and to be able to show it on the ground humanizes it for somebody here.
Let's go a little into the logistics of everything. Sure. You did mention you had a small team going with you.
Yep.
What kind of prep did you go through beforehand?
One, for example, an infectious disease expert. We had a session. We went through everything, just basic knowledge on Ebola, what we know, and that took away some of the scare factor, some of the things that we were unsure about. We learned that unless you are in direct contact with the infectious fluids of somebody who's sick, there's no way to catch it. It was very reassuring. I talked to other reporters, for example, who had been over. There's not a lot of them, and there's not a lot of Canadian ones. There's very few. At that point, there was only one other Canadian reporter who had been over to West Africa. I spoke to her, and she told me the best piece of advice. She said, the risk is manageable. And in the end, she was absolutely correct, because I was way more worried and anxious before, because once you get on the ground, you realize everything is you can be in control of the situation. We had to make sure to gather the correct gear. Plenty of things like gloves. We had bleach-based wipes. We did practice, and we brought the full PPE, that's the personal protection equipment, the spacesuits.
Right.
We did practice putting them on and off. And we had a supply we were there 7 days on the ground. We had enough potentially to have to use every day.
Were they necessary?
They were not necessary. They were not necessary. And that's something, you know, you learn going through it. And this is what I meant before when I said it was an unprecedented assignment. Nobody really knew. So you almost did have to over-prepare. We brought a lot of our own food, you know, just non-perishable stuff and MREs. We even looked into things like protective cases for cameras.
Right.
We brought things that potentially would, you know, we could dispose of. You know, I didn't bring my personal phone, for example. I brought one that it wouldn't have, you know, been heartbreaking to lose, right? You know, safe to say, yes, I was anxious going in, but the moment I hit the ground, right at the airport, they've got a bucket with a chlorine solution, and the first thing you do is you wash your hands with this. And you, from that moment on, you practice your good habits. You don't touch your face a lot. You don't, well, or at all. You don't shake hands with anybody. I mean, it seems like the most unfriendly thing to do, and this is in a country that's super friendly. And it's kind of funny, in the end, we did have a lot of this protective gear. The gloves were well used, things like that. We wanted to make sure we did use gloves a lot, because one of the things, again, this goes to being able to manage your surroundings. It's rainy season in West Africa, in Liberia. There's downpours every day. Surfaces get slippery when it's wet, and you can fall, you can trip. You know, nothing, it's nobody's fault, but it can happen. So if you fall, you want to make sure you don't have an unprotected part of your body that's touching the ground and goodness knows what else. So the gloves were always used, long pants, long sleeves, rubber boots that were constantly disinfected. Your vehicles, cars, constantly wiped down door handles and the trunk. We'd go in and out for our equipment. Always sprayed down. We carried around bottles with those spray nozzles and inside the solution, and we just used it constantly. Some of the equipment, we did have leftover equipment when we came back, and you know what? It went to good use, because we met Liberians who can't afford stuff like that, and we gave it to them. We gave them our buckets and our bottles and our leftover gloves and even some extra clothes that I brought that, you know, there's a bleach stain on it. You know, wash it and wear it. But awareness was slowly, I think, growing, and interest. And we heard it from the people. What do we do? If you give me those gloves, how many times can I wear them, or do I have to throw them out right away? Questions, curiosity, and real interest in how to protect themselves.
In terms of monitoring your health, what was that process like on the regular?
We took our temperatures regularly, 2 or 3 times a day. You watch for spikes, and you know, I was never really worried. We as a team were never really worried because we never exposed ourselves to direct contact, to any risk, but it's good practice, obviously.
Thankfully it didn't happen,
Yeah.
But worst case scenario, what would be your protocol for, let's say, if there was an emergency, if one of you did have a fever, experience symptoms?
We would have just gotten out as soon as possible. The last thing we'd want to do is, you know, get trapped in that kind of health care system that needed all the help in the world.
You were accompanied by a security expert on the ground as well, too. So tell me about that.
Yeah. The CBC, as a corporation, thought it was necessary, and frankly, we were glad. I did talk earlier about keeping the team small, but as luck would have it, the person who assigned to us was also a ex-military, but a medic as well. So that was very comforting that he was a health care specialist, a medic himself. He took care of things like making sure our vehicle was sanitary and cleaned down and scrubbed down. He also would be responsible for taking everybody's temperatures, for example, and that included our fixer and our drivers. They're local people that we hire on the ground there. The last thing we'd want is to expose ourselves inadvertently like that. And so we were very conscious of who we hired locally, and we found some great people. And if you have people who really know the lay of the land, you can get from A to B safely and quickly, and with all our deadlines, that's totally imperative.
Bringing it back home, what precautionary arrangements were made in advance for your return to Canada? You did mention the 21 days that you had to spend.
The healthcare community, doctors generally say, refer to a 21-day incubation period for Ebola. So if the worst was to have happened, you know, it was necessary for us to monitor, self-monitor, we called it, for 21 days. So we continued to take our temperatures for 3 weeks. We were not in a quarantine, but we also did not go to work inside the CBC building. There was a decision made that we would work outside of the CBC building. And that was more of a, calming the work environment thing, because of this fear that did take hold. Not everybody would be comfortable with us there. And rather than create a problem, it's just easier to just go with it. To go with it, we created our own office space and worked for 3 weeks on a lot of follow-up stories. I personally was not worried. I had absolutely zero fear that I had caught something because I never put myself in that situation. I can say the same of the entire team. But unfortunately, not everyone felt the same way. So, you know, I did limit myself to where I went. Despite the challenges, I would go back. I think my colleagues would go back. Because it's important. It's a health crisis like none other that we've known in recent times, and Canadians have to know about this reality in another part of the world, that humans are suffering, and we can help.
And finally, I want to know from your trip, what's the image of Liberia that you'll carry with you when you think back to it?
I think it's some of the individual people that we met, the children, some of the faces of the little children who lost their parents. We spent a day at the Doctors Without Borders MSF treatment center. That really, it did stand out. And while we were there, we met a woman who was just about to be released. She survived. She lost her whole family. Her name was Jenna, but she survived for the first time in probably over a month, because she had been in isolation. She had Ebola. She was contagious. Somebody touched her. They held her hand. And for a survivor to feel the touch of another person's hand, that's so important in those very first few moments. She had just gotten her her certificate, her test, she passed the test, she didn't have Ebola, and somebody touched her, and I will never forget her face.
Well, the piece turned out fantastic, stunning and heartbreaking visuals. Thank you so much for doing this, Stephanie. And Stephanie Jenzer, producer for CBC's The National. I'm Mariel Torrey-Franca for J-Source's International Reporting Bureau based at Humber College. Thank you.